Arcade Classics 4 for Game Boy. This final entry in the Arcade Classics line of Game Boy ports of classic arcade games comprises two Williams arcade classics, Joust and Defender. Now a couple years later, the now defunct Midway Games would release another compilation of Joust and Defender for Game Boy Color, one that I reviewed years ago. That was a top-notch quality conversion of two classic arcade titles, and one I'd recommend checking out if you're into Joust or Defender on the go. And the best part was that it was backwards compatible with Game Boy, Game Boy Pocket, and Super Game Boy, so right there I'd say go with that version because it's more true to the arcade originals than this earlier take. But that's not to say that this earlier release from 1995 courtesy of Williams and Nintendo is entirely worthless, it's just different. Perhaps a bit too different. Well, not necessarily in the case of Defender, whose gameplay remains the same for the most part. You defend the humans from the space aliens trying to capture them and turn them into mutants. You have lasers, bombs, and hyperdrive abilities at your disposal. In terms of the overall gameplay, Defender makes the transition to Game Boy fairly intact. Control is pretty solid and easy to pick up. The challenge varies regardless of which skill setting you've selected. The game certainly looks the part, explosions animate well enough, and you can even invert the colors so that the background is either black or white. This probably has more use on the Game Boy than it does the Super Game Boy, but the option is there regardless, and either way you go, it's still a solid iteration of Defender on the go. On the flip side, Joust is given a rather serviceable conversion on the Game Boy that maintains the core gameplay of the arcade original, which is to eliminate opposing jousters with your fluffy bird ass, or your lance, that works too, and collect their eggs before they hatch. There's even survival waves and stuff like that. It does have some quirks that makes this version unique. For example, this version of Joust can only have 4 jousters on screen at a time. That means you're always facing off against 3 jousters, and when one is eliminated, another takes its place. Also, whenever you die, the game goes into this intermission thing before you respawn, something that Joust doesn't normally do, but turns out there's a reason for this. See, unlike other versions of Joust where you had 2-player competitive play, this version has 2-player alternating play, which means 2 players can take turns playing Joust. It's a nice way to have some semblance of multiplayer on a Game Boy cart without the use of a Game Link peripheral, but it also feels a bit odd and inorganic. Joust also has 2 flavors of play. A classic style where the game plays more or less the way it does in other versions of Joust, and an updated style which zooms in on the action, giving you full-size sprite work which looks a little better than the tiny figures on the full-screen view, and there's even a background in this mode. But the scrolling is detrimental to the overall gameplay since you cannot see the entire playfield, and thus planning your attacks proves a bit more challenging for all the wrong reasons. Ultimately, it is doable, but not that much fun. Arcade Classics 4, much like the rest of the series, is Super Game Boy compatible, which means special color schemes and fancy borders. And on the Super Game Boy, you have nice looking title screens for both games, and Defender looks pretty good. Joust? Not so much, but then again I've seen worse. Sound-wise, it's not too bad, not great, but not bad. There's an option to enable constantly droning music, and both games have their own unique annoying piece of music that starts to grate after a good while. Fortunately, the music is optional, and that's a blessing in disguise. Actually, it's more like a straight-up blessing, but I digress. Overall, Arcade Classics 4, Defender, and Joust for Game Boy... Well, they tried, and in fairness, both games are fairly well represented here. They both play well enough, even with Joust's limitations, and for what it's worth, it's not that bad of a collection. However, if you want a version of Joust or Defender that's a little more arcade accurate on the Game Boy, then I'd recommend picking up the Midway release for Game Boy Color, which is backwards compatible with older Game Boy units. This one in particular isn't bad, but that one is simply better. The end.